think about your open source as, so the open source essentially you'll have access to only a subset of the total users.
Yeah.
When you're enriching data and reaching out to them from an outbound lens. The trade-off here being more people are using it, you just don't know who they are.
Yes.
Right? So if you make it a little bit more tactical, I think first would definitely be setting up a community where you can bring these developers into a fold and engage with them. Now that could be like a customer, like a community portal that we have at Appsmith for our open source edition. It could also be Slack, Discord, to be able to run and manage these communities. And then the next step is to add content. Like your documentation should be so much on point that they are able to self-serve their issues and clarifications. Like self-serve nature of OSS doesn't have to stop at sign up. Once they're into the product, if the documentation quality is such that they can go and read and figure it out for themselves, if they've encountered either an issue or they have a question, that really will speak to the way they're using the product without having to reach out to your support team. Right? So I think that becomes a very important part of how you're managing this community. What resources are you providing? So at an overall level, I would say that developer resources that you have for your open source edition need to have really high quality and need to be usable, readable, and tactical enough for anybody to go and solve whatever they're looking for. Right, so that's first on an overall basis, a segue to monetization, because that establishes brand, that establishes credibility.
Hey everyone. Welcome to the new episode of the Modern DevGTM Brew. I'm your host, Appsmith. Today we are diving into a highly sought after topic, something which is very close to my heart and one we are actively addressing here at Reo.Dev. In today's episode, we will explore how to boost your revenue pipeline by leveraging an open source community. And joining us in this discussion is Neel Pattani. Neel is the Director of Revenue and Business Operations at Appsmith, a global leading open source internal tool builder. Neel brings a wealth of experience from his previous roles at KPMG and Deloitte, amongst others, and he's also an active investor and startup advisor. Neel, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for that, Achintya. Great to be here. I'm glad you all reached out to have this conversation. My first podcast, so I hope this goes well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We are very excited. So to begin with, the first question that was really intriguing for me after looking at your profile was your career path actually, which was from working in finance at Deloitte to Director of Revenue and BizOps in a developer-focused company. So could you share more about this unique transition?
Yeah, sure. So after I finished CA, which is about a decade ago, spent a couple of years across consulting firms working on buy-side and sell-side due diligence projects. I also tried my hand at a travel startup with a couple of friends. It didn't work out. I was fairly naive, but obviously it was a great learning experience. From then, the interest still peaked on the startup ecosystem, and hence while I was trying to get into buy-side roles at that time, industry was not open to my kind of profile, right? So it was hard. It took me almost a year to land the gig, 3 months to get recruited. After I started interviewing. So while it was difficult, it was a fun journey. And that's when I decided to move to Bangalore, took up the role with the India network, got into investing. And I think post-investing is when you actually realize, at least at that time, which is like about 5 years ago, what first principle thinking looks like on the other side, what problems people are trying to solve and how they're approaching solving it, right? Like, so the more you learn, the more curious you get, okay, what's actually happening under the hood? And investing only takes you a certain way. Hence, I moved to the operating side and now eventually landed up at Appsmith. One of the things that obviously I built comfort was I knew Abhishek before this. He was my neighbor in my previous building in Bangalore. And when we and I were having a conversation, he said, this would probably be like a good role for you to look at. We sort of figured out. I was consulting initially and then converted full-time here. And was like I was super interested in what he was building. I liked that it was remote. They light on their feet. We're across 14 countries, or to put it differently, we're only not in Australia and Antarctica from a continent perspective. So that worked out well really for me, right? Like I was in India, now I live in Jakarta, so it's life is there and I'm able to move quite easily. And open source monetization in India, what I realized from research when I was told that not many people know that. So if you have that skill set in this geography, you will also be fairly distinguished. So I thought overall it made sense as an opportunity, and hence I'm here. Yeah, lots to learn, but I think at Appsmith, given the culture, being outcome focused, and second being very open to employees learning, that really attracted me because it's not something I've done, right? So it's, well, you can think first principles, but if you put in the effort to learn, I think they're okay with sort of you coming into the fold. So that's sort of been the overall journey.
No, I always agree, and like some of the participants, like folks I've met are or have been first principle thinkers. But coming to sort of Appsmith, and like it has such a huge open source community, but in a strong open source community, contribute to revenue generation. Especially, what are the signals that devs or teams that look to identify if this open source account or organization is ready to upgrade to an enterprise tier or anything else that we look at?
Yeah, so I think open source communities are like the link between them and revenue generation is a little hard in terms of attribution. What I do believe they play a good role for is creating awareness for your brand, and then B, establishing credibility as a segue from awareness. Like when you look at open source, and the reason there's a lot of love for it, like developers love freedom and control over what they're building. They want to look under the hood as to what is happening. They have access to the code, self-hosted. So if you have these three things in place, it becomes extremely self-serve for them. They don't have to talk to sales, which is something that they categorically avoid. That makes for an interesting play for you to get your product out there and be used, and possibly gain feedback through engagement that you do on sort of communities or portals. So direct revenue generation link or signals are hard. I actually feel like you can use the open source community to do work on two different things. One is you can cut it into inbound and outbound. So you have inbound leads that come in, right? Those will be mostly because X is a developer at a certain company. X tried your product, loved it, felt like there is a use case for it after he or she built a prototype or a POC. And when business leaders or IT buyers come in with a problem for which this became a right solution, he would essentially put their hand up and be like, this is something we should evaluate. And then the buyer steps in and says, okay, let's look at pricing. How scalable is this? How will this work in our production environment? Then, developer ops, security, access controls, SSO, all of those things sort of then start to come in, because then it becomes more of a buying process. So for inbound leads, I would say they're more of your champions rather than, and it's difficult for you to establish that link, right? Like there could be an inbound lead where someone spoke to their buyer who was a decision maker for the budget, and that person has now come and signed up and booked a call with sales. And they may or may not disclose this, but for you to know it is hard. So it's kind of indirect. The second is more reactive for you, which is outbound. So out of the entire ecosystem of developers that are using you, you'll have either people who don't tell you anything. So that's a black box. You don't know who they are. You don't know what they're doing. Second is going to be either email or you know what they're doing. And third is going to be both, where they'll give you their email. They also give you access to what they're doing. And by access to what they're doing, you only just know engagement and usage. You don't know anything else. Like what they're hosting is they're hosting it themselves. So you have no access to any information otherwise. So that gives that data when you enrich, and then you locate their IT buyers, or their sort of IT buyers is a very relevant persona for us, but for their buyers or your ICP in those companies is how you can do an outbound, and then you reach out to them. So it's fairly indirect or reactive. So it's product led on one side and reactive on the other side. When you look at the type of leads that you will end up getting, as a result, its attribution is a little tricky when it comes to revenue.
Makes sense. And eventually, if somebody is so highly open source focused, eventually you realize that there's some attribution by the end of the day or the other, right? And it is very interesting to sort of, divide this whole thing into, these are the ones, this is the strategy which is inbound in nature, while these are the ones which are, sort of outbound in nature. I wanted to also get a bit deeper into the how of it. Like, how do you guys, like, what is the next step once you understand that, okay, open source can have, you can get inbound, or you can have a more reactive strategy, which is outbound. Like, how do the GTM teams then operate going to the next level of effectively monetizing an open source user base?
So think about your open source as, so the open source, essentially you'll have access to only a subset of the total users.
Yeah.
When you're enriching data and reaching out to them from an outbound lens. The trade-off here being more people are using it, you just don't know who they are.
Yes.
Right? So if you make it a little bit more tactical, I think first would definitely be setting up a community where you can bring these developers into a fold and engage with them. Now that could be like a customer, like a community portal that we have at Appsmith for our open source edition. It could also be Slack, Discord, to be able to run and manage these communities. And then the next step is to add content. Like your documentation should be so much on point that they are able to self-serve their issues and clarifications. Like self-serve nature of OSS doesn't have to stop at sign up. Once they're into the product, if the documentation quality is such that they can go and read and figure it out for themselves, if they've encountered either an issue or they have a question, that really will speak to the way they're using the product without having to reach out to your support team. Right? So I think that becomes a very important part of how you're managing this community. What resources are you providing? So at an overall level, I would say that developer resources that you have for your open source edition need to have really high quality and need to be usable, readable, and tactical enough for anybody to go and solve whatever they're looking for. Right? So that's first on an overall basis, a segue to monetization, because that establishes brand, that establishes credibility. I think the second is when you look at from an outbound lens, you can, once you have a data set which is enriched, you can look at categories, you can look at sectors, and then you can look at functions and then categorize them based on use cases for, which function. You could be focused on marketing or HR or finance, or you could be across functions. And as a result, you pick ones that are relevant for an industry and then categorize and do outbound campaigns, right? So that makes it a little bit more tactical in the response to what data you have and what you want to do with it. And the next is an inbound. The interesting part is if you can figure out a way for you to know async or have a regular update on these are the email IDs, these are the people, these are the companies that are on a community edition and have told us who they are. The moment a call gets booked with sales, they are able to look up and check if there's somebody already here. So imagine the first conversation, if there are companies whose some team member in some geography has been using us, that establishes credibility, which goes a long way. And that's the first conversation. I think that sort of right out the door, it creates a certain level of impression, which otherwise is very difficult to do. So that is one very valuable way for you to create sort of brand presence even in the room as you walk in. And you're talking to somebody new, right? You don't really know them. And I'd say refreshing this data set. Third is look at how often do you want to do it depending on volume. You can do it every week, every 2 weeks, 4 weeks. And then keep going back at this loop and see what you sort of learn. And yeah, so one thing I also missed was when you're looking at the community, getting feedback and listening to them, which is what DevRel does fairly well. That helps you pass on valuable things to product, because that will help you improve where all you're seeing issues pop up, or you're saying that this functionality from a user either interface perspective or an experience perspective doesn't really help. That's another loop that gets created through the community.
That's a very interesting answer and a very interesting sort of loop that you are talking about, which is about developer experience, communities, documentation, and then sort of moving on to sales. But there is also sort of involvement of various departments here. And I understand that something like this must be needing a lot of collaboration between sales and DevRel teams. So how do you do that to build an effective revenue pipeline?
Yeah, so I think with collab between sales and DevRel, so DevRel is involved when it comes to revenue generation, I think, to generate pipeline and to convert it. When it comes to generation, I think what helps is, so DevRel and sales work together with, say, it's either the two of them tag team or someone like RevOps comes in to have like a data center where you have information, like you did a one-time exercise, okay, you have 5,000 emails or you have 4,000 emails, right, of people from your community. You enrich that data set and you know that 3,000 are relevant for you today. Let's figure out how do you do a marketing campaign for them or an outbound campaign with a very specific use case. So you can do a bunch of things there. Once that is done, the results are reviewed on a more ongoing basis. DevRel and sales can catch up and be having sort of a feedback loop or system where they're able to tweak what they're doing with this data. That 3,000 becomes 3,300 in a month, so 4,500 in a couple of months. And like it'll keep building as in when your community grows, the number of people that give you access to their email will grow. So that ongoing relationship really helps, but that's more to do with lead generation. I think when converting pipeline, it's only when something super technical is needed is when probably DevRel will step in. It's a large account it's something that will be a large deal or a large account. And as a result, it's a little bit more sporadic where they will come in and provide the solution and, talk about what is it that the engineers can do while they're using your product. So I think the things that have, and while this is something that we are still figuring out how to sort of implement and do on a more ongoing basis, we did an exercise similar to this a couple of quarters ago. The other things that have worked is building rapport between DevRel and engineering, just the way sales and the buyer or the decision maker essentially develop a relationship, right? And given the both engineers and developers, there is a lot of shared context. As a result, rapport building becomes easier. So when you do that, and you can do that through either these kind of calls or conversations where, developers are seeing how to use your product, or something like training or workshops, because you've bought say Appsmith, or you've bought some other product, but your engineers want to learn a bit more from the actual people who built it and know more about, how do you use it in the most effective manner. That helps develop those relationships. And it's basically, the way I say it is you let each run with their scope. So sales is good at selling. You should let them run those relationships. Well, engineers know their community well enough, so they're able to establish that relationship well. And I think probably the most important thing that DevRel can do, at least in this context, when they're center stage talking to a customer which is potentially going to sign with you, is show the developer what is it that you're doing with this product, right? What are the interesting things that you can do? What are the use cases that the developer would find important and relevant to know about? Because then that changes sort of the conversation, maybe a little bit even away from the use case and a little bit more technical, but still relevant to the developer. And that's a good segue into what not to do, which is, and a couple of DevRel folks told me this, is the devs can smell a salesperson a mile away. So don't use DevRel to double up as salespeople, because it's not effective. In fact, it's negative because it erodes trust. And that's a very strong statement or a very strong sentiment that comes out, right? And you don't ever want that in your product. You don't want trust to be eroded in your product ever. So using each of the functions which is where they're good at really will, sort of make a difference.
And great. I mean, this was about lab. I wanted to come to the other side of it, which is attribution. And I understand, for DevNet teams, for open source first companies, attributing to revenue has been tough. It has been challenging. Market finances. How do you deal with this kind of a challenge? Because by the end of the day, every team, every initiative has to be linked to some kind of a revenue.
So I would say for DevRel, the challenge, while you're right, revenue attribution is a challenge. What does help is sort of earmarking what is their North Star. Like, what is the outcome you want DevRel to focus on? And fundamentally, DevRel's focus will always be making sure more developers are using the product. And emphasis both on developers as well as using. So there has to be more developers and more usage. It doesn't matter if you have 100,000 developers and there's nobody using it, right? So as in when you grow sustainably, so that you're seeing engagement on the product as well. And I would say the only way to close this loop is if you can generate whatever leads you generate, if you can capture information from those calls or those conversations where you can weed out, okay, are there actually developers working here? Did you hear this from a dev who works in your team or an engineer who recommended this to you? That's one very direct way to attack it, right? Because then you know that this came from, okay, this person was open source, and then they came into the sales funnel where they booked a call with sales. But outside of that, I would say just leading indicators, and this is a very direct one, but from an indirect standpoint, the leading indicators would be, maybe say SEO traffic. How many people are actually searching for your brand name? Because then you're very well known, right? Then you really know that this is working well, that people are not searching for, HR tech or internal tools, but they're directly like putting in the brand name that they want to be, that they want to find more about. And I'd say maybe third is community engagement. Now, the challenge here is that, well, it is easy to use the word engagement. It is very hard to measure it. So, like, what do you use to measure community engagement, right? So, the one way to look at it is the folks that you have access to for usage on the community, which is your open source community. Look at how that is trending. If you can pull cohorts, and all of this is while anonymized data, right? Like, it'll just tell you how you are measuring usage of the product. What does that look like month on month? And that is another sort of indicator of, okay, if there is growth here and we're seeing more inbound leads, maybe there is correlation. And that's as best as a proxy that you might be able to reach to. But otherwise, the attribution is quite tricky here. Like, I don't think it's figured out yet.
Makes sense. Another thing that we were discussing is developers, of course, are hesitant when it comes to engaging with sales teams. But at your end, what are some of the effective strategies you have observed in overcoming this challenge of selling to developers?
So I think selling to developers is, I think it's not selling to developers, it's selling via them. So they are the routes that you take to enter an organization. They are your influencers or champions internally. So you have to satisfy them as the first step to get into any large organization or any organization for that matter. And as a result, what you'll have to do is you'll have to make your product self-serve. You'll have to make a lot of things that they can learn and read and see, do async, because they don't want to talk to anyone, which is very clear, right? Like when you self-host something which is open source and you don't have to give any of your own details, basically download, you run with it, and you could be working at, I don't know, Microsoft, NVIDIA, FANG, anywhere. And I never really know, right? So you have to be very careful about how you make your product and how much is it on the developer first scale. Is it close to 1, 5, 10? How would a developer essentially rank it, right? If they're using it, so their feedback becomes really important. And the reason I mention this is because, and why they are your champion is, I'll give you an example of what happened at Appsmith itself. We're trying to create some training and certification for our community edition, and the developer on the team said, I want to use Threadly as a tool to be able to manage the certifications that we're issuing. So then the buyer persona at Appsmith, who is managing the budget, essentially goes and checks out the pricing and probably the viability and how does it work, what do we need to do, look at the docs and all of that. So this as a loop does work. It's very clear. Internally, we are also doing the same thing, right? We're getting recommendations from a developer and then we're going and checking out a product. So that loop is fairly clear. So the way you have to approach selling to a developer is to remember, you will never sell to them, you will sell via them. So you have to make them happy to establish your brand internally. And then someone else will come and check out the rest of the things that they want to probably take off.
Hard. Neel, and probably this is the last question, and I ask this to all my guests here, are what is books, podcasts, and other resources that you recommend for DevTool GTM teams and leaders?
Yeah, fair. I actually read fairly little on GTM per se, but a couple of people that I really like. One is obviously Besmer's Atlas really helps. They also have specific courses on GTM, on pricing.
Talk a lot about developer-focused companies.
And developer-focused companies, their thesis is also fairly widely published. It's a good market map. So they generally have good data overall and GTM specific as well I am yet to go through some of their courses as well, but that's my go-to for content. I think another is Lenny Richinsky. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but he writes a lot about growth, SaaS, in general. That's been helpful sort of information. And then there is a more tactical sort of a GTM newsletter which is on Substack, which I found helpful to read. I think all of this sort of put together just helps bring structure to a lot of chaos which you might be otherwise facing at your own organization. So a lot of people refer to a lot of different things, but I think as long as that content brings together a lot of what you want clarity on, that'll help. And this has been what has been helpful for me so far. And I try to read out more for bootstrap SaaS businesses, because that's something I find super interesting. It is a business which you can bootstrap fairly easily and reach a decent scale of revenue. So like Clay.io's story, which has been doing the rounds a lot of late, has been quite nice. I just had a call with them last week. So their founder's interview was fairly interesting to learn about how they manage through everything, like from ICP to monetization to figuring out what is it that they want to be as a use case for someone.
So awesome. Thanks, Neel. Thanks for all your time here. And yeah, it was so great.
No, likewise. And thanks a lot for having me. I look forward to more of this.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Ajitya. Take care.